you feel that God is moving. The testimonies, and I want to encourage you to lean into this. When we feel God moving, when we feel that He's stirring something, I want to encourage you to lean in. And that's what I'm talking about today, leaning in. And I was reading a story, we're going to be talking about the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And I was reading this to Abby the other week. I don't think it's more spiritual than it was. Abby wanted to be quite like jumped on it. It's not an every night thing before you think otherwise. And she was wanting to read chapters of John, and we got up to reading the 5,000, and I was reading it to her, and something stirred in me as I was reading this. And so I leaned in. God, are you maybe saying something to us about this? And it was Andrew's response to Jesus whenever he asked for a problem, a solution to the problem. And so then I thought to myself as I was lying in Abby, I might store that in the archives and maybe do that as a one-off sometime, but I'll let it be rude. Like to be back. Don't like a deadline. Some people work to a deadline, Neil thrives under pressure. Not such. And then Neil and I were chatting about the teaching series, and he says, do you know, Joe, I really don't want off. Have you got anything? I was like, yeah, I do. And so I felt the Lord had been stirring something in me. So I want to talk today about leaning in with the little. If we have the next slide up, a few years ago, the girls went through this phase where they had their hearts set on these, you know what these are, cabin beds. And they're so fun. You got the sofa and the desk underneath, and I was like, oh, this actually might be really good. And then I looked into the cost of the ones that we wanted, 600 quid. 600 quid. And I was like, man, that's £1,200 for two of them. I was like, oh my goodness. And so I was uncertain of how many years we would actually get out of the girls using them, combined with if you try changing bed sheets at night. It's not fun, is it? It's not a great experience. And so my enthusiasm, I wasn't really getting behind it. I mean, I did for a while, and I was like, no, I'm not really going to put a lot of effort into this. So Ella then inquired. She was really keen, and she inquired about the progress of maybe these cabin beds. And I just said, I'm just honest, I said, honey, I think they're too expensive. I'm not sure how much use you get out of them. I'm not sure, to be honest. But they're just so much money. And seeing the problem as the cost, Ella replied, she said, Mommy, it's okay, use my pocket money. And it was a super sweet moment. She did go on to tell her teachers that she was doing chores so that she could save up her pocket money to buy her own bed. Which didn't really like it. And the teachers was like, oh, I think that's great. And so I'm judged as a parent. And I said, what's going on here, but okay. But it was so sweet of her. But she was leaning in, wasn't she? She had this thing that she really wanted, and she thought, I can't fix the whole cost, but I can give you my £7.50 or my £10. I can add what little I have, and that's a good start. And this is what we see in this parable, is how Jesus took the little. Now, the little wasn't going to solve the problem, but with Jesus, it did. So this story is in all four of the Gospels. It is actually quite fun to compare them, because you don't have lots of stories that are in all four of the Gospels, and so it is fun to kind of compare them, because they take some different stances, different perspectives on it, and they're all trying to bring it from a different angle. And I'll just be talking about the story as a whole today. I've looked through them, I've compared them, and I'm going to bring it up to speed on it. We're going to read it from John, and that's because that was the one I read with Abby, but also this is the only one that includes a discussion with the little boy who supplied the picnic. Some might say the main character who supplied the picnic. We really wouldn't have had anything without that picnic. So we're going to read it from John, if we can have that up. Please, John 6. So sometime after this, Jesus crossed the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, but he already had in mind what he was going to do. Love a test, don't we? Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each person to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place. And they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. So there was minimum 10,000. So that was 5,000 men. So you add women and children to that. So you're talking minimum 10,000, probably maybe more like 12,000. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is come into the world." And Jesus, knowing they intended to make him king by force, withdrew to a mountain by himself. So there's a couple of interesting contextual things to note about this passage before we look into how this applies to us. The grass was green, and actually this translation, it tells us that Passover was there. But the fact the grass was green tells us that this was during the time of Passover. But this is the middle of 3 messages that were given during the time of Passover. And this one particularly points us to the liberation of God's people. And it's symbolic of God providing manna and quail in the desert, like he did for the Israelites when they were in the desert. This miracle is symbolic of that. And parallels have been drawn between Moses and Jesus in this passage. Maybe you made that connection before, but I just didn't. And this is about God providing what is enough. So you know, in the desert, he didn't provide a week's worth, he provided what was enough for that day. And now he's providing what is enough. Interestingly, you know, Jesus didn't actually go there to minister. Jesus was exhausted. He had been doing a lot of ministry, and he was retreating to a quiet place with his disciples. They'd got him, and they were retreating to a quiet place. And he gets to the shoreline. There's 12,000, 10,000 people standing there wanting him. They're spiritually hungry, they're laterally physically hungry, they're wanting to ask him questions. And I don't know about you, but I empathise with this, as will most parents. The number of the times you turn around and there's a child right there, isn't there, wanting something to eat. They always want something to eat. Got a question in my face, needing something, always needing another snack. But Jesus was moved by compassion when he saw the crowds that were there. He could have turned away to the guys, I'm exhausted, I need a break. Actually, he came here to be alone, but he didn't. He was moved by compassion. And this word compassion literally means to have one's inner being, your viscera, stirred. So that is like that pull from the inside. That's not just, you know, seeing a little lost puppy and having compassion on a lost puppy, or me trying to quiet my children with a snack. That is something inside him being twisted, and just that stirring of compassion that moved him. And so this word is only mentioned 12 times in the gospel. This moved by compassion. And 8 of these are in reference to Jesus, which is quite stirring, which is quite revealing about this moment. So he saw their need. He saw these people, and he was deeply moved. They were sheep who had followed him. They were exhausted. They were hungry. They were wandering around in the desert, and he was moved by compassion. And so he demonstrated the power of God to meet their need. But that was quite a big problem that he had. So he's ministered to them, and he's got thousands of people who are hungry. What is our response to a problem? Do we say, like Philip, that would take over, what did he say, half a year's salary to give them all just one bite? That's too big a problem. Or like Andrew, does he say, I don't know what you're doing? What is our response to a problem? How do we bring in the power of God? How do we lean into the power of God? And the answer is, start with what you have and give the little. That picnic was not enough for 12,000 people, but they started with what they had. They let in, I don't know, but here's a picnic. And let's see what God can do whenever he adds his power to what we give. Okay, so the 4 points that we're going to have, if we have that up, is start with what you have. Give what you have to Jesus. I've spelled that wrong. Give what you have to Jesus. Obey what he commands and conserve the results. Okay, so start with what you have. A boy's small picnic. And what we learned about this picnic was it was actually a poor picnic. Barley loaves were a sign of poverty. Barley bread was the worst kind of bread. It was a sign of poverty. So this wasn't a charcuterie board of a picnic. This was a poor man's picnic. One of the commentators interestingly said, let's give thanks for mothers who give their sons something to give to Jesus. I like that. Let's give thanks for mothers who give their sons something to give to Jesus. I've never thought about the mum in this story. I've never thought, thank goodness, she gave that boy a picnic that morning before he went out to do his work, and that Jesus then had something to do with. So obviously a poor family giving what they have, and Jesus has moved upon that. He took the most ordinary thing and turned it into one of the most extraordinary miracles. Now this miracle is accounted for in history books. There was thousands of people witnessing this miracle. This isn't something that you can say, it almost takes more faith to not believe it than it is to believe it. It's so beyond our belief. But he turned it into the most extraordinary miracle. And I love Jesus in this scenario, being tested. Guys, what we're going to do here, we've got 10,000 people that we're going to need to feed. The sense of a test, Andrew panics. How many of us panic? Like, it's like when you go to order something and you don't know, it's like that kind of thing. And Andrew just goes, picnic! Oh, it's a picnic! And he's like, he's got enough faith to say the word picnic, and I imagine him then like instantly regretting it. I sound like a fool. Why did I say that? I should never have said that in Jesus. He's going to need something so much more. And Jesus is like, yes. All I needed was you to lean in, Andrew. All I needed you was to look around, give you something to work with. It wasn't enough. It was a poor boy's picnic. But Jesus said, you'll lean in, and that's enough. I'll take it. I wonder if afterwards I'm just like, give what you have to Jesus, and the little becomes a lot. The boy didn't need to give up his lunch. I love the fact that the scenario in John, the story of John, shows the fact that the disciples were mingling with the crowd. They were getting to know people. They weren't just standing, at a conference up front behind Jesus, but actually they were getting to know the people. They were mingling. And Andrew got to know that there was this boy here who had something, knew a little bit about his life, enough to know the boy had a picnic in his bag. And you've got to have a conversation with someone to know you're stashing a picnic, don't you? But then he gave what he had to Jesus. Often we think that for Jesus to move through us, we need to have it perfected. Don't we? I need to have a good enough voice, or I need to have a polished enough preach, or I need to be mature, or I need to be experienced, or I need to know what I'm doing. Well, I've got a shocker for you here. You don't. You don't need to have it figured out. You just need to come as you are. You just need to come with the little that you have and give it to Jesus. Neil and I, shocker again, are often out of our depth. We often are going, Jesus, I don't know what we're doing here. Oh my goodness, what do we do here? But we're just giving what we have to Jesus and letting him do the rest. Sometimes it just looks like turning up a Sunday and going, God, I'm here. I'm going to let you do the rest. Sometimes it's just having a conversation with a neighbour about Jesus and letting him do the rest. Sometimes it's just inviting a meal to a neighbour who you know is struggling and letting God do the rest. It might just be volunteering on a rota and letting God do the rest. If you think you've got nothing to give, I want to say to you in the kindest way, that's nonsense. Absolute nonsense. We all have something to give. Billy Graham was one of the greatest evangelists gone down in the history books. His influence was incredible. The ministry that God did through him was incredible. But do you know who influenced him? His Sunday school teacher, who was just turning up and doing what she knew to do. And it was his Sunday school teacher. So don't think that you've got to look like Billy Graham. Just give what you have. Maybe you need to think your offerings to Jesus and stop discounting the little. Maybe, I'll say that again, maybe you need to rethink your offerings to Jesus and stop discounting the little. Okay, the next one, obey what he commands. Do what he says, no matter how it seems. So remember Noah and the ark? Do you imagine the middle of the boat? When there's been no rain? Telling people, build a huge boat for all the animals and us. Could you imagine? Can you imagine building a wee boat in your front? In fact, it rains quite a lot here, so maybe I use something else. But could you imagine? And it's like this, imagine being one of the disciples saying, right guys, time to sit down, time for lunch, what we having, don't know. There's a boy over there with a career picnic, but all I know is that you just sit down and they followed the instructions of Jesus, even without knowing how it was going to end. We don't know how things are going to end, but faith looks like the one step, the next step, the next step. Do you remember when we had no children and we felt in this church and we felt sick for our two, we felt God saying, hire a children and families worker. Got no money, got no kids. Hire a children and families worker. We took a step. We took the next step. We took the next step. And look at how God's been growing the young people in our church. And this is where we feel that the Lord is blowing his spirit again now on the youth. It's exciting. So we obey what he commands, even when we don't see the end result. Jesus was the producer of the miracle, and the disciples were the distributors. And that's the same in our lives. God is the miracle maker. God is the producer. We are the distributors. We're the ones who obey. We're the ones who just do what he said and let him move through us. Chris, I've asked him commission to tell us some stories about him today. But Chris was telling us on Monday night, whenever he was at the opticians, and I think the lady said to him, slow back. And Chris just felt that nudge of the Holy Spirit, so he went in. Can I pray for you? Most of you are going, but Chris has been on a journey of leaning in, and he leaned in and he prayed for her, and she was really blessed by that conversation. And she said a comment at the end about how blessed she was by the fact that Chris had done that. What was Chris doing? He was doing as Jesus told him to do. He was following the commands of the Spirit. And then finally, he served the results. They were diligent and they collected all the leftovers. And imagine being that boy when he gets home to tell his mom, you will never guess what happened to that picnic. I wonder if we got a basket to take home, like how cool would that be? Where did you get 12 baskets from? Anyway, could you imagine being that boy, like, Mom, cool story. But this is the testimony. This is recording the testimony of what God does. And this is one of the things why we love people coming up and sharing what is God doing in your life. We want to conserve the results. We want to remember the testimony. Remember, God told the Israelites to build a pile of rocks so that every time the generations would walk by them, they would say, what does that pile of rocks mean? Well, that's whenever God delivered us from the hands of the Egyptians. That's whenever God provided for us, because they were conserving the results, they were remembering the testimony. And that's what we want to do in your own lives. Do you know, it's crazy how quickly you forget. God can do the most amazing miracles. And I don't know how it happens, but you can forget. So write down, some way record what God has done, that time that He provided for you. That time that He was faithful, that He answered our prayer. I try to do that with our kids. I try just to remind them. Do you remember last week you were praying for such and such? And have you noticed that this happened this week? That's God answering your prayer. So I was trying to help them join the dots. Trying to remind them, God's faithful, God hears you. And then stewarding that as well. So Jesus was dealing with hungry people. And this story, this miracle, was a sermon in practice. Later on, Jesus goes on to talk about how He is the bread of life. I think it might be a couple of stories down after this one. Jesus talks about how He is the bread of life. And this is a sermon in practice. And He is still moved by compassion when He sees and when He looks at hungry people. He wants His power to come, to bring transformation to them, to bring them what they need. But today, for us, hungry people might look a little bit differently. They might not look like people needing food. It might. In North Berwick, in East Lothian, it might look like food drives. It might look like things like that. But hungry people aren't limited to physical hunger. It might look like something else. It might look like hungry for peace, hungry for healing, hungry for transformation, hungry for something to fill that void, to fill the aching that people have in their lives. I'm going to see if this video works. Can you see if this video will work? Okay, I'll give you a running commentary as the video, as the silent video shows. I'll give you a running commentary. You can start again for it. I'll just change your accents. Okay, so you've got a group of friends traveling in a car, and she's moaning about being really hot. She's hitting her friend, and he says, "Have something to eat. You're not yourself when you're hungry." It's Aretha Franklin. And so you eat something to eat. Look, changes. He goes, "You're always a diva when you're hungry." Anyway, you're not yourself. You're not you when you're hungry. There's a whole series of them. Go home and watch it with the audio. So much better. But the whole thing is, they've got a whole series of them where they bring in famous celebrity people and act about in situations where they say, "You're not yourself when you're hungry. You're a diva when you're hungry, or you're whatever when you're hungry. You're not yourself when you're hungry." Hungry people can look messy. Hungry people can look broken. They can look needy. They can look challenging. And that's just me. Because they're not being difficult. They're hungry. They maybe don't even know it yet. They maybe don't even know that they're hungry. We have a child in particular who when they... It's 50-50. Whenever they get hungry, they fall apart. And any other parent empathize with us. We call it hungry. This child literally is not themselves. And you can't tell her you're hungry. I'm not hungry. And then like a mother bird, I'm calling it, pop finger in her mouth. And she just transforms into this other, and she goes, "Oh, maybe I wasn't hungry." And I have to force feed her because she gets hungry. I'll own it. They get it from me. I get hungry. I like to think that I know when I'm hungry, don't always go. But what is our response to hungry people? Because people are not themselves when they're hungry. And that's not just physical hunger, if I need to make that more direct. That is spiritual hunger, emotional hunger, a hunger for Jesus, a hunger for peace, a hunger for his power, a hunger for healing. Whatever that hunger might be, people are hungry for Jesus and they're not themselves when they're not hungry. That is such a big word. They're not themselves when they're hungry. So what is our response to hungry people? Will we be moved by compassion for people who are hungry? And will we lean in and give the little that we have so that God's power can move through us to bring them the transformation that they need, the food that they need, the spiritual food that they need, the healing that they need? What is our response to the impossible? Logic, impossible. The disciples tried that. It would take more than half a year's wages to give everybody just a bite. But what you can do is you can start with what you have. You can give what you have to Jesus. You can obey what he commands. And you can remember the testimony of what he's done. If we have a final slide up, it says, in the crisis hours of life, when resources are low and responsibilities are great, it's good to remember that God already has the problem solved. And that was Wearsby who wrote that. So I want to encourage you this morning to lean in. Leaning in doesn't look like having the answer. It just looks like sharing a picnic. Lean in with what you have. Lean into the impossible. Lean into the hungry. And watch God work. Amen? I've been so inspired by Chris. Oh, do you know, if you couldn't make it on Monday night, go grab him at the end, get him a coffee, and sit down with him and let him tell you the story of his journey of going to Brazil. Because Chris was sitting listening to sermons and he kept hearing about if you're hungry for more, then go to Brazil. Do this outreach, go to Brazil. So he went, I don't know, I'm going to go to Brazil. And he went to Brazil, his life was changed. He let in to God. He let in. He was hungry for something. And he said, I'm going to lean into this. And it's been amazing to watch Chris come alive and lean in and see that transformation in the opticians. To see that transformation as he's calling out words of knowledge and wanting to see hungry people encounter the power and the transformation of Jesus. But he let in. Now, we don't all have to go to Brazil, although I would encourage you to lean in some way to what Jesus is doing. How can you lean in to what Jesus is doing, to what he's saying to you? It doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to be perfect. It might even be you just saying, okay, God, that's true. I want more of this.